The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of our guests and panel members and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of any institution any member of the Nova Society is associated with. The material information presented on the Nova Society is for general information purposes only. Reproduction or dissemination for the purpose other than education is prohibited without express written consent of the Nova Society. We'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society, and today we go back to the mailbag, and we actually specifically picked out this question. It is from a young lady, a high school student in Chicago, and she expresses the concern and fear her and her peers have regarding the direction of society and the violence in society today. And she asks, is this the society our generation is leaving hers? And what can her generation do now, possibly change the direction of society as a whole? So let's listen in.
I have little to do at the beginning of the summer. I may have to write a book or something. I have no excuses.
You have no excuses not to write the book. All right. So today
we have our super question.
Yeah. Let's see.
Sounds like Brooklyn's really aching to answer this question.
Well,
I think it's exciting to hear from a high school student.
It is.
Yeah, that is really cool.
All right. So, yeah, this is from a high school student, Stephanie, who lives very close to Chicago. And she writes to us, "Hi, Nova Society. I'm a high school student in Chicago and love studying the history of our country and history in general. I'm hoping you guys can answer this question that has been bothering me and many of my classmates. I know that history books tend to water down some of the more embarrassing points of history. Dr. Baum mentioned a book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, and I've read it from cover to cover, and I can tell you the author is very happy that you bought it and read it. And even my history teacher enjoyed it. I'm just going to assume the history teacher doesn't enjoy very much. But anyway, we study a lot of stories about how Americans battle other countries and how the United States was created. But now we are seeing Americans fighting Americans. The politics in the U.S. seems to be getting more extreme, and people are becoming more afraid. The U.S. has elected people saying violence is okay. In the Trump trial, jurors are afraid of being found out. I think one left the jury the other day because she was afraid, and that is true. Somebody did leave. We don't learn that this is something that America has experienced before, but my friends and I talk about this stuff a lot. We are wondering if this is what we're growing up into, and is there anything we younger people can do to help change any of this? So we'll start out with, is this the world that they're growing up into?
Yep.
Yep. This is, and it's not your fault. It's not your generation's fault. It's ours.
Yep.
It's our generation fault.
Blame the boomers.
Blame and the millennials who are now old enough to vote, and
we've been trying, but there's so many damn boomers in the way.
Yeah.
we just won't die out.
No, God dang it.
Priscilla, I'm going to talk to my fellow boomers here, even though I don't really consider myself one. But it's depending on how you think the war ended, when the war ended, and when the post-boom war
Embrace
boom
your
began.
inner exiness.
And and I'm not even sure I fit into that category either. But in any event, it's not like we didn't grow up with KKK and John Birch Society and others. The right wing of this country has always been violent. And the big difference that we had when we were younger was that the left wing also began to get a little bit more violent, and with the Weather Underground and radical groups like that. But growing up in the 70s, you certainly saw a lot of violence when we were younger. And, it's just something that happens in this country. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that my mother's family was leery about coming to America from Scotland, because they look at American films, they see American violence, and they assume that it was just part of the daily existence here, and didn't want to come here for that reason.
Yeah, that's one reason why Canadians, when I was living in Canada, they were afraid to come here. Were afraid if they said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing or looked at someone the wrong way, they'd be shot and killed.
In
Yeah.
Florida, for sure. That would happen. That could happen.
Yeah, well, they were afraid to go anywhere. At least some people were, but a number of people were afraid. Yeah, unfortunately, yes. And as my colleagues have said, there is a history of violence in this country, and it just seems never ending. It seems relentless. That is what you and your friends and your generation, that is what you're inheriting. It deeply saddens me, and I feel deep shame as well that that people. I don't know if I really never considered myself a boomer. And certainly it depends on when the war ends, but or when one's idea of when the war ended is. In any event, I understand the concerns that you and your friends share. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Regarding what you can do,
How about don't be like us?
Yeah, don't be like us. Consider running for public office. Educate yourselves to the greatest extent that you can. I would say in as interdisciplinary a manner as you can. Consider carefully what you want to do for a career.
That's so gentle, though. I think there's also there's something to be said about, in the late 60s, there were organized groups who would protest. There were those that would peacefully protest. There were those that would violently protest. It made a difference. There's not a lot of space right now, I think, in terms of American consciousness for protesting. And so that's allowing the groups who have the guns to come together. They rally together. They're loud, they're vocal, and they're the ones who are marching their streets right now. We need the people who are actually concerned about what's happening in the country to also be loud and vocal and express themselves. And maybe that does mean en masse organizing protests. That may mean en masse social media bombing of various organizations and groups, trolling, whatever that needs to be. But it's beyond just being informed at this point. It's about learning to weed through the noise, have the information literacy to be critical of what's out there, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. There is a lot of misinformation out there.
And
so you got to sift
disinformation.
And disinformation. You've got to sift through all of that, and you've got to do something about it. And the doing something varies by different people. 2017, I went to Washington, D.C. with my fun little pink hat. And to be very specific, it was pink Mickey Mouse ears in the shape of the Cheshire Cat. I figured that got the point across.
We also would like to see a picture of that.
Right. It was the first time I ever did a march. I did another protest in Boston, over women's rights a little while ago. But on the other hand, I pour a lot of what I want to do into my work. So I'm getting the message out there in a way that I find safe and comfortable. But some people really do need to, be out there and be loud and vocal. So if I were to directly speak to Stephanie, if Stephanie was right in front of me, I'd be do what you need to do, what you feel most comfortable doing, but do something.
Yeah. And, I picked this email out specifically, not just because you were from Chicago, which is where my wife was from, but the fact is that you are aware.
Mm-hmm.
The comment that I know history books tend to be watered down. Understanding that, yes, a lot of history that we teach in primary school is really propaganda. You're not going to hear a lot of the bad stuff of what we did, and we've done a lot, and it's okay. And you see a lot of legislatures when they would try to ban books and we would try to, curriculums and things like that, they would do it because they want to water it down. But we learn so much more from our mistakes than we ever learn from our our successes. We really do learn from our mistakes. And the fact that you recognize that people are afraid, that you recognize and you're paying attention that a juror left because she was afraid she was outed, to the public, that you truly understand this, and that your friends talk about, as you would say, this stuff a lot, that gives us hope. I mean, that really does give us hope. In my generation, Scott and Brooklyn, I can't speak for the other two, but I could speak for myself. Politics wasn't discussed very much between friends. We talked about, what the Mets were doing or sports, things like that. But when we were in high school, we didn't pay attention to what was going on in the world. I mean, as far as around the world. And the fact that you're paying attention to it, I think is a huge, it's a huge kudo to you that you are aware. And in many cases, if the rest of the country was more aware of what's actually going on, I think we'd be a lot better off. But, as Priscilla says, you get involved as you are. I get involved through writing, and I get involved. I was given a great opportunity to write some courses about social justice and about activism and things. That was a way for me to give out my voice of what I thought this all meant. And if you were ever to take any of those courses, you would hear me, because that was my belief in what has to be done or how to go. So, as far as anything younger people can do, keep being aware, and be aware when it's not right. Say, hey, that's not right. We're not going to do it that way anymore. And that's probably the best advice I can give. Scott?
I guess the last point I'd make on this is that there are a lot of people with crazy beliefs that go around the internet, as we said before, disinformation and misinformation. But rarely did political leaders get involved with those. And now we have one who does. And he's, still the front runner, still leading this race. And the idea that most of the people, I think, that have committed acts of political violence have done so because he supports it. And I can give you any number of different examples of him saying, either pushing fringe ideas as if they were mainstream and truthful, or just promoting violence, like, saying Mark Milley should be executed. The punishment would have been death, or saying that different groups are poisoning the blood of the country, and referring to political opponents as vermin and things like that. All of those are great examples of violent rhetoric spurring stochastic terrorism, creating the fertile ground for the, crazy people, the insane people, to go and commit acts of violence. And, I think they talked to 12 people who had committed acts of political violence, and 6 of them were ardent Trump supporters. So I think that the leadership is a big deal, and that we need to sort of distance ourselves at some point or another from that kind of rhetoric. And this crazy person, former president of ours.
And as Scott has always said, society always progresses. So Stephanie, my comment would be is you can take heart in the fact that society always progresses. And society of my time of growing up, when I was your age, was probably better than society as when my parents or my grandparents were. But there is a tendency for younger people to say, I'm not going to do it like the old people did it. And that's something else you got to hold on to, because that older generation that has created this will die out eventually. But always remember, even though the person may die out, that idea will always be there. And that's the thing that you've got to be able to stand up against. Like Scott said, the KKK, things like that. Those ideas never went away. They just never went away. And that's what we have to be on guard for. So hopefully you'll write back, Stephanie. She did ask in the email, and I have to put this in, if she could be on. And unfortunately, Stephanie, since you're a high school student, probably not. We'd have to get like parental consents and things like that. So unfortunately, when you graduate, you go to college. When you get past that thing, you're more than welcome to write back, and we will be happy to have you. But I think one question, let's just go around real quick, because I'm going to write back to her, and hopefully she'll be listening to this. What's a question you have for Stephanie?
What is her deepest concern moving forward? I think.
Yeah,
Scott?
I mean, it would be more about, the fact that she and her friends are talking about this stuff is very encouraging, of course. And what other subjects do you want us to cover? We're all educators, and we're all willing to educate as best we can.
How about you, Priscilla? I mean, you, as you always remind us, you are the younger one of us. I mean, this is.
You're the one reminding you, not me.
The only one without gray hair.
You're the only one without gray hair.
That's a lie. You just can't see it in the camera.
Oh, okay, it's hard to see when you're a ginger.
Truth. Blends in nicely.
If this was your child expressing this, what would you say?
Well, if this was my child expressing this, what I would probably say is, give me a specific question. Let's talk it through. Because and this is, I recognize not everybody's experience, but I challenge whatever is coming out of the school system. So when she brings me home something that's on her mind and asks me, I'm like, okay, let's talk it through. Let's talk about what really happened. Let's talk about, what you've been told. Where did that information come from? Like doing a lot of that kind of critical analysis on it. But I guess for Stephanie, what my question would be is, like, in those places where you recognize that the history is watered down, how are you finding the rest of the history? How are you filling in the gaps that you perceive in your information? And again, what are you doing about it? So I'm thinking, for instance, I lived in Texas during the season of the great textbook fiasco, which I guess is how many years now? Almost 20?
Pretty much.
I should clarify, the more recent textbook fiasco. Texas has a long history of pushing through textbook agendas. And one of the reasons that one was very loud was because it was one of the first ones that had social media attention. And so there were more optics into what was happening in that textbook debate. And I think it was also because of the social media spotlight, the level of impact Texas had as one of the largest markets for the textbook companies, I think surfaced as well. And folks were like, oh, hello, we don't like that very much. And in those debates, we're hearing things like, Moses is a founding father, and Thomas Jefferson is too rebellious to be a founding father. I think at any point, if you're seeing a history textbook, something that like blends historical information with religious mythology, then now you've got a whole different, you need to call shenanigans on that book. Another one that came out of that Texas thing was the idea that slaves were migrant workers. So it's like, well, maybe we need to call shenanigans on that, because that's very much misrepresenting slavery. And folks need to hear you call out those shenanigans, and I would love to hear what kind of things are in the textbooks right now, that smell like shenanigans, so we can all collectively call them out together.
Yeah, and I guess my question would be is that, all right, Stephanie, at your age, you are inundated with the social media of the times because you grew up with it. three of the four of us on this panel did not grow up with computers at our hands we remember actually having typewriters. We do remember those things. And the question that I would have for you is, how much does social media make you afraid? Is this where your friends are getting that fear from? That the constant social media, the constant, input that you're getting from social media, be it whatever platform that you're on, is this what is making you afraid, or do you think it's more informing you? And that would be my question to her is, and hopefully she'll answer back with those questions, because they are good questions. And this is the next generation. We always pick on the fact of, boomers and millennials and this and that and the other. But the fact is that this is somebody that I'm going to make the assumption in high school, somewhere between the age of 16 and 18. This is an important generation. This is the generation, and I can understand her frustration. This is the generation that can't vote yet, but has to live with the mess that we create. And it's not only politics. It's not only politics in any way. It's the environment.
Oh my God! I was about to say that.
See that? Great minds are working together. I mean, it's things like the environment. I always say the decisions that I make, and as I've gone over, and I cannot say this has been the way it's been my entire life. Whenever I make decisions today as to what to do about things like this, I always think of, how is this going to affect my grandchildren? It used to be, children, they're old enough they can take care of themselves, mine. But it's the grandchildren. How is this going to affect those grandchildren of mine that are preteen or just turning teenagers? How is all this going to affect them? If it's bad today, it's my responsibility to try to make it better for them. And I think that, that we're probably more aware of that today. I'm sure Priscilla is more aware of it with her family than we were maybe with ours sometimes. I know it's a lot different than my parents. My parents didn't think about what was going to happen when I became, 20. That wasn't their problem. And I know my grandparents didn't care. So the question comes down to it is that, remember, there's a lot more out there than politics, and it's your generation that's going to have to fix it, unfortunately. But you can legitimately ask, respectfully, the generation before you to get off their duff and do something as well. Hold them responsible. And I know that can be sometimes very, very tough, because it's very easy for older people to say, sit down and shut up, you're a kid. Your input doesn't matter. Well, you know what? Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it does. And I'm not so sure that the question really needs, in my view, to be asked all that respectfully. I was thinking about the word respectful and thinking, well, I mean, I understand your point, Mark, about being respectful, but there comes a time when one has leaders with space lasers, and as you were saying before, Scott, promulgating and propagating violence and conspiracy theories and all sorts of absolute nonsense, and Priscilla, like with these books and whatnot, where I would even question using the word respect, because clearly the leaders don't have respect for the public.
But generally, I guess I say respectfully, because when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about, you're talking to your parents. You're talking to your teachers. You're not going to be talking to Space Laser Lady. You're probably not going to be talking to any of these other people.
True.
You are going to be talking to your parents. You're going to be talking to maybe even your grandparents and people like that, teachers, administrators of your school.
Right.
I mean, we see all the time students standing up when a school board is meeting, students standing up at school board meetings.
Right.
And
True.
wanting to be heard. And it's usually the most impactful and effective ones are the ones that do it respectfully.
That's true, of course.
And if you ever, I agree with you. If you ever come before Space Laser Lady, probably you don't have to be all that respectful. But The fact is these are not the people that you're going to normally deal with. And the people and it starts right there. It starts with your parents. It starts with your teacher. It starts with, in your community. That's where all this stuff gets the ball rolling. You break these problems down into little bits and take them one at a time.
Yeah, and I guess you're right, Mark. I'm going to contradict myself. If one is not respectful, one is just as crude as the other person is, and you have to model and show leadership yourself if the other person isn't going to do it.
And you want to show how you want to be treated.
Correct. Yes. Yep.
Don't do it in the manner that the person that you want to change is doing it. Yes. Show them by example, this is how this is done.
Yes.
And I think you'll find that that's going to be. So Stephanie, I hope we've answered your question, because it was great. It was actually, I have to admit, when I saw that you were a high school student, I was like, oh yeah, we got to do the high school student.
Yep.
Because we don't get very many high school students. And especially, I think the thing that got me was you're aware. You and your friends are aware.
Definitely.
And that does give me hope, believe it or not. That gives me an awful lot of hope. All right. So that's it for Stephanie.
For now.
For this week. I would be willing, and I'm going to make a prediction on this one. I bet you I'm going to send this out to Stephanie today. And I'm going to probably try to edit this so that this actually is the one that we broadcast today. And I'm going to bet that we hear from Stephanie next week.
I hope so.
I do too.
Yeah, I'd like to have.
We could change it from the Nova Society to the Stephanie Show.
Yeah.
Which would be kind of cool.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this episode. BH Conflict Resolution Services, a full-service dispute resolution firm offering expert and cost-effective mediation services to couples, groups, and businesses. BHCRS can be reached at www.bhcrs.com. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms. We'd like to thank all of our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershworth, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.